A pilot on an urgent flight accidentally crosses into the Bermuda Triangle. Everyone survives, but subtle, unsettling changes in the passengers and crew spiral into their most horrific nightmare. The call came just past midnight, when the world outside his apartment windows was silent and heavy with a kind of darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly over the sleeping city. Captain Daniel Mercer had been halfway through a restless dream when the ringing pierced through, snapping him into consciousness with the instinctive alertness that years in aviation had drilled into his bones. He rolled over, eyes squinting against the dim glow of his phone screen, and saw the operations number, the one they never dialed unless it was urgent. He answered immediately. "Captain Mercer?" The voice on the other end carried that clipped, businesslike tone he recognized from dispatchers who'd been running on caffeine and chaos all night. "We have an urgent long-haul request. Crew availability is thin, and you're next in line. It's a direct to Lisbon. Astronaut departure window in 3 hours." Daniel sat up, rubbing at his face, already calculating the logistics in his head. He'd been rostered for a series of domestic hops after a 2-week break. Not an international stretch, but saying no wasn't really an option, not when you'd built a reputation as the guy who would get it done. Lisbon? That's a new one for me this quarter. What's the load? Full cabin. Overbooked by 4, actually. We're rerouting them over the Atlantic to avoid a storm pattern, so you'll be taking the southern arc. Daniel's fingers paused on the edge of his nightstand. The southern arc? Filed and cleared. Weather models show minimal turbulence. Shouldn't be an issue, the dispatcher replied briskly, like they were reading from a script. He didn't question it further. You didn't, not in this job. You took the flight, you trusted the route, and you flew the plane. That was the rule. And yet, as he packed his overnight kit, pulled on his crisp uniform, and stepped into the pre-dawn chill, something uneasy settled in the pit of his stomach. By the time he walked through the terminal doors at 2:15 a.m., the airport was a ghost town, lit in sterile fluorescence. The crew was already assembled at the gate briefing room. First Officer Jalen, a sharp, quietly observant co-pilot, barely 30. Senior Purser Amelia, who'd been with the airline long enough to remember when smoking was allowed in flight, and a handful of flight attendants Daniel hadn't flown with in months. The air carried that subdued tension of professionals moving through the motions while too tired to talk much. "Morning, Captain," Jalen greeted with a small nod. His eyes looked a little too awake, as if wired on adrenaline rather than coffee. "Morning. How's the weather looking?" "Clear out of JFK, patchy clouds mid-Atlantic. Tailwind should shave 20 minutes off." It all sounded routine, yet something about the phrase mid-Atlantic seemed to echo in Daniel's head. He brushed it off, focusing on the checklist, the pre-flight walk-around, the subtle scent of jet fuel in the cool air as they boarded the Boeing 787. At 3:05 a.m., the cabin doors sealed with a mechanical thump, and they pushed back into the darkness. The runway lights blurred into streaks as the engines roared to life, and soon they were climbing through layers of cloud that caught flashes of moonlight. Daniel settled into the rhythm, hand on the yoke, eyes scanning instruments, voice calm over the radio. It was 4 hours into the flight when the deviation came. ATC advised a reroute further south to avoid a developing storm front that had grown faster than expected. The coordinates they fed through were unusual, but not unheard of. A wider sweep past Bermuda before curving toward Europe. Jalen raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, inputting the change. Somewhere between waypoint BRMDA and open ocean, the sky shifted. It wasn't turbulence, exactly. The air remained eerily smooth, but the light dimmed in a way that made the cockpit feel smaller. The ocean below turned from reflective silver to a flat, inky black that swallowed the moonlight whole. Instruments flickered for a fraction of a second, then steadied again. "You seeing this?" Jalen's voice was low, almost hesitant. Daniel nodded without taking his eyes off the readouts. "Could be magnetic interference. Keep an eye on the compasses." They did. They also kept flying. Passengers in the cabin remained unaware, sipping lukewarm coffee and flipping through seatback screens. Amelia called up to say the cabin felt off, though she couldn't explain why. Then came the sound. Not mechanical, not environmental, something else. A low, resonant hum, as if the air itself was vibrating. It seemed to seep through the fuselage into their bones. The radio crackled with half-formed transmissions they couldn't decipher. And just as quickly, it stopped. Hours later, Lisbon appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its coastline glowing under the early morning sun. The landing was textbook perfect, yet the moment they touched down, Daniel knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the way the passengers looked at one another, hesitant, distracted, as if waking from a shared dream. It wasn't just the way Amelia kept glancing at the cabin walls like she was expecting them to move. It was in himself, too, a hollow feeling lodged behind his ribs, like he'd left something back over that black water. News traveled fast. By the time they'd cleared customs, European media was already picking up chatter about instrument irregularities and unexplained communications interference on Flight 228. Social media exploded with speculation. Bermuda Triangle theories, secret government tests, paranormal interference. Daniel avoided the cameras. He gave the official debrief, calm, professional, vague, and went to his hotel, where he sat in the dark and stared at his hands for hours. The following week, he returned home to New York. His wife, Laura, met him at the door with a hug that lingered longer than usual, her fingers trembling slightly against his back. Their 2 kids clung to his legs, laughing, but when he looked into their eyes, something inside him twisted. He'd made it back. Everyone had, but he couldn't shake the thought that maybe they hadn't come back the same. Daniel didn't notice the first strange thing until a week after he got back. He was sitting in the living room, watching his daughter Zoe build a tower out of plastic blocks on the carpet while the faint sounds of Laura clattering dishes came from the kitchen. It was early evening, winter light already fading outside, the kind of cozy domestic scene he used to cling to during long flights away from home. But as he leaned forward to help her balance a piece on top, a sudden wave of dizziness swept through him. It wasn't the familiar disorientation of jet lag. This felt heavier, a deep pull in the center of his skull, like gravity had shifted for just a moment. He blinked and it passed. Zoe was still stacking blocks, humming to herself. Laura called from the kitchen, asking if he wanted tea. Everything was normal. Except it wasn't. Over the next few days, he began catching himself staring at nothing. He'd look out the window and lose track of minutes. The shadows outside seemed darker than they should be, the corners of rooms deeper. When he went for a morning run through the neighborhood, the air would sometimes feel heavier, sound muffled, like he was moving underwater. And he wasn't the only one. Jalen called him out of the blue one afternoon. "Captain, you been feeling weird? Since, His voice had the cautious edge of someone testing the water before diving in. Daniel hesitated. Weird how? I don't know. Dreams. Bad ones. And I keep losing time. Like I'll be driving, and I'll get somewhere and have no memory of the last 10 minutes. Daniel didn't say he'd been having similar lapses, moments where he'd look at the clock, certain it was one time, only to find 20 minutes had slipped past without notice. Passengers from Flight 228 started making headlines. First, a businessman from Chicago missed an important meeting after oversleeping through 3 alarms, apparently something that had never happened in his 20-year career. Then a young couple posted a video claiming that since the flight, light bulbs in their apartment burned out almost instantly. A woman from seat 14A wrote a viral Facebook post about feeling off and losing her appetite entirely. The airline issued a statement about routine post-incident evaluations and assured the public there was no evidence of any lasting effects. But the tabloids pounced. Bermuda Triangle ghost flight? Blared one headline. Everyone came back. But did they really? Asked another. Daniel avoided reading them. 2 weeks later, Amelia, the senior purser, called him in tears. Her cat had died suddenly. She swore it was healthy the day before. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that her front door lock had jammed from the inside 3 times that week. The list of oddities grew. Jalen's car stalled on the highway in perfect weather, no mechanical fault found. Another crew member broke her wrist in what she called a stupid accident involving a perfectly stable chair. Daniel himself had a near miss while driving, when a traffic light turned green and then, without warning, switched back to red. He slammed the brakes, heart hammering, as the driver behind him laid on the horn. Sleep offered no refuge. The dreams came slow at first, then nightly, always of the same place. Black ocean under a moonless sky, the hum in his bones, a horizon that felt too close. He'd wake drenched in sweat, ears ringing. Laura noticed. "You're grinding your teeth again," she said one morning, touching his jaw with gentle fingers. She didn't ask why he'd been staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., breathing like he'd run a mile. The tension seeped into their life like a slow leak. He became quieter at dinner, less patient with the kids' noise. He found himself checking the locks twice, sometimes 3 times before bed. And then the big one hit. 3 months after the flight, a major news outlet broke a story. One of the passengers, a woman in her late 40s, had been found unconscious in her apartment. No forced entry, no medical history. The paramedics couldn't explain why she hadn't woken up. The comments section filled with speculation. Daniel's name started popping up in threads, along with blurry photos from the Lisbon landing. People wanted answers he didn't have. They wanted to know if the crew had felt anything, seen anything, heard anything. He gave no interviews. But he started wondering, not just if they had flown through the Bermuda Triangle, but if something had flown through them. The airline called him in for an evaluation. Standard procedure, they said, but the doctor kept circling back to stress. Pilots are prone to high cortisol levels, she told him. Sleep disturbances, mood changes, it's not unusual. Daniel nodded, playing along. But the truth was, he knew stress. He'd flown through lightning storms, diverted mid-flight due to engine trouble, even had a passenger collapse in the aisle once. Those things rattled you in the moment, but they didn't cling to you like this. Laura tried to be supportive, but the strain was visible. One evening she admitted, "I feel like you're here, but not here." He didn't have an answer for that. Then came the accident. Not his, Jelon's. A freak electrical fire in his apartment, traced to a surge that shouldn't have been possible with modern breakers. He escaped with minor burns, but the building was gutted. When Daniel visited him in the hospital, Jalen looked pale and older somehow. "It's all connected," he whispered, eyes darting toward the door as if someone might be listening. "That night, over the water, we brought something back." Daniel didn't ask what he meant. He didn't need to. The final straw came one evening when he was tucking Zoe into bed. She looked at him with sleepy eyes and said, "Daddy, I heard the airplane noise in my room last night." He froze. "What airplane noise?" She pointed toward the window. "The one from the dark place." That was when he knew he couldn't keep flying. Daniel didn't quit right away. He told himself he'd take some time off, get his head together, maybe push for more short-haul assignments. But the truth was, the thought of stepping into another cockpit made his stomach twist. Every time he heard the distant roar of an engine overhead, he felt the hum in his bones again, just like over the black water that night. For a while, he kept up appearances. He went to the kids' school events, smiled through dinners with Laura's parents, mowed the lawn on Sundays. But there was an invisible thread pulling him back to that moment in the flight, that wrongness in the air, the subtle vibration that had no place in the world he knew. The media attention didn't help. 3 weeks after Zoe mentioned the dark place, an investigative program aired a segment titled Flight 228, Mystery in the Triangle. They had talking heads, retired pilots, oceanographers, even a self-proclaimed aerospace psychic, all speculating on what had happened. The psychic claimed the passengers had been marked by something ancient. Daniel didn't watch the whole thing, but he saw enough to know his face had been on the screen, captured from Lisbon Airport CCTV, looking exhausted and disoriented. They froze the frame at the exact moment he'd rubbed his eyes, making him look even more haunted than he felt. The airline sent out a memo telling staff to avoid media contact. Daniel barely needed the reminder. And yet the calls still came. Unknown numbers. Voicemails from reporters promising sympathetic coverage. A podcaster who claimed she'd had the same dream as he had, the black water, the hum, the horizon pressing in. The more he ignored them, the more he felt the story was slipping out of his hands, morphing into something else entirely. Meanwhile, the misfortunes kept stacking up. Amelia's house flooded after a freak burst pipe. One of the passengers, a young man in his 20s, lost his job after being caught shoplifting, something his family swore he'd never done before. The woman in the coma was still unresponsive, her case now drawing fringe theories online about temporal displacement sickness. Daniel himself had his first real scare one rainy morning in April. He was driving Zoe to school when the windshield fogged over in seconds, so fast it was like the air inside the car had shifted. He swiped at it with his sleeve, but visibility dropped to nothing. By the time he pulled over, his heart was thudding in his ears and Zoe was asking, "Daddy, what's wrong?" That night, he told Laura he was taking extended leave. She didn't argue. For a while, things seemed to settle. Without flights to prepare for, without the mental countdown to his next takeoff, his breathing came easier. He and Laura spent more evenings together on the couch, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in silence. He cooked more, learned how to make Zoe's favorite pancakes without burning them. But the dreams never stopped. Sometimes he'd wake to find himself sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, the faint echo of that low hum still vibrating in his chest. Other nights, he'd dream of looking down at the ocean and seeing shapes beneath the surface. Not fish, not whales, but something vast and shifting, moving with purpose. He started keeping a journal, trying to write it all down in the hope that seeing it on paper would rob it of power. But reading the entries later only made him feel worse. May brought a new wave of public interest. A popular true crime YouTuber released a 2-hour documentary speculating that Flight 228 had been part of a secret military test. He used grainy audio clips from air traffic control, slowed down until the static almost sounded like whispers. The comments section exploded with theories about government cover-ups and interdimensional exposure. Laura saw it before he did. "They're never going to let this go," she said quietly one night, laptop closed on her lap. "Even if you quit, even if you move away, it's always going to follow you." Daniel didn't answer. She was right. One afternoon in June, he ran into a former colleague at the grocery store, another captain he'd flown with years ago. They made small talk for a few minutes before the man's tone shifted. "You know," he said, glancing around as if someone might be listening, "I had a triangle run back in '09. Different route, but close enough. Something strange happened to us too. Not like yours, but close." Daniel wanted to ask, but the man just shook his head. "You're doing the right thing, staying on the ground. Don't tempt it twice." The way he said it, "don't tempt it twice," lodged in Daniel's brain like a splinter. By August, the chaos among the passengers was undeniable. Another one lost her job after a sudden breakdown in a meeting. One man's marriage ended abruptly. The online forums tracking them began calling it the 228 curse. Daniel avoided reading them, but sometimes Laura would tell him snippets, just enough to confirm that whatever had touched them in that patch of ocean wasn't letting go easily. And yet life went on. Zoe turned 7. They had a barbecue in the backyard, neighbors laughing under strings of warm lights. For a few hours, Daniel felt almost normal. That night, after everyone left and the house was quiet, he sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey. The air was warm, crickets buzzing, nothing unusual at all. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he could still feel it, the subtle pull, like the sky and the ocean were one vast, breathing thing, waiting. He knew he'd never understand it, and maybe he didn't need to. 2 months later, he sent in his resignation. The airline offered counseling, part-time groundwork, even a teaching position. He declined them all. He didn't want to be near the planes anymore. Instead, he started working at a small local marina, helping with maintenance and boat repairs. The pay was nothing like flying, but the work was steady, the air smelled of salt and wood, and he could be home every night. Some days, he'd watch the horizon and think about that night, about the hum, the shadows under the water, the way time seemed to slip sideways. He'd wonder where they'd really been. But most days he just enjoyed the quiet. He had more dinners with Laura and the kids in 1 year, than he'd had in the last 5 combined. He went to school plays, Saturday markets, Sunday hikes. The dreams still came, but less often. The hum was softer now, almost like it was fading. Almost. And whenever he woke from them, he'd lie still, listening to the normal night sounds of his home, the soft breathing of his family down the hall, reminding himself that he was here, that he'd made it back. Even if part of him never really had,